Number 10. The Ubaid culture. The world before Sumer, before the Sumerians built Uruk, before cuneiform turned clay into memory, before the first city-states rose from the mud of southern Mesopotamia. There was another world already shaping the future. It is called the Ubaid culture, and it stretched across parts of Mesopotamia and the wider Near East from roughly the 6th to the 4th millennium BCE. It did not leave famous kings. It did not leave epic poems. It did not leave a written explanation of itself. But beneath the world of Sumer, the Ubaid laid some of the foundations that would make civilization possible. The Ubaid people lived in villages and early towns scattered through landscapes of river, marsh, canal, and dry plain. They farmed, herded, fished, built houses, made pottery, traded across long distances, and began organizing community life around structures that look like early temples. These were not yet the massive ziggurats of later Mesopotamia, but the pattern was already forming, a special building raised above ordinary life, a sacred or communal center around which society could gather. That is what makes the Ubaid so important. They appear before the dramatic explosion of urban civilization, but they already show many of the behaviors that cities would later depend on. Communities were growing larger. Labor had to be organized. Irrigation and water control became more important. Craft production became more standardized. Exchange networks moved goods far beyond one village. Social differences began to appear. The Ubaid world was not a city civilization yet, but it was learning the habits of one. Their pottery spread widely, with recognizable forms and painted designs found across enormous distances. That spread suggests more than simple trade. It suggests shared style, communication, influence, and perhaps a cultural identity that crossed local boundaries. In a time before writing, pottery became one of the ways archaeologists can see connection. A bowl, a jar, a painted line, a repeated form. These are the fingerprints of a world linking itself together before it had text to describe that connection. But here is where the mystery begins. The Ubaid also left behind some of the strangest figurines in prehistoric Mesopotamia. Many are small clay human forms with elongated heads, narrow faces, and eyes that can look almost reptilian to modern viewers. Some hold infants, some appear seated. Some seem connected to household life, burial, fertility, ritual, or identity. They have attracted wild speculation, but the truth is more unsettling than fantasy. We do not know what they meant. They belong to a symbolic world that later cities inherited only in fragments. This is the problem with cultures before writing. Their influence can be huge, but their voice is gone. The Ubaid may have helped establish the temple as an organizing center, the village as a coordinated community, irrigation as social infrastructure, and long-distance exchange as a normal part of life. Yet we do not know the names of their leaders. We do not know the gods they served. We do not know whether their temples were ruled by priests, elders, households, or something we cannot imagine. Their world is visible in layout and clay, but silent in meaning. By the late Ubaid period, the conditions were in place for something larger. Settlements in southern Mesopotamia began moving toward the Uruk world, where cities, writing, bureaucracy, and monumental institutions would transform human history. Sumer did not emerge from nothing. It rose out of older experiments in settlement, ritual, agriculture, and social organization. The Ubaid were one of those experiments, not a footnote before civilization, but one of the buried roots beneath it. That is why the Ubaid culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It reminds us that the first cities were not sudden miracles. They were built on generations of unnamed people learning how to live together at larger scales, how to manage water, how to gather around sacred buildings, how to share symbols across distance, and how to turn village life into something more complex. The Ubaid did not write history, but they prepared the ground where history would be written. Before Sumer spoke, the Ubaid had already taught the mud of Mesopotamia how to become a civilization. Number 9. The Halaf culture. The painted world before the first states, before empires wrote treaties, before kings counted grain, before Mesopotamia became the land of cities. There was a prehistoric world spread across northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and parts of southeastern Anatolia. It is now called the Halaf culture, and it flourished roughly between the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. It did not build ziggurats. It did not leave royal inscriptions. It did not conquer territories with armies we can name, but it created one of the most recognizable and beautiful material cultures of the ancient Near East, long before state civilization fully formed. The first thing that makes Halaf stand out is its pottery. Halaf ceramics are among the finest of the prehistoric Near East, thin, carefully fired, painted with geometric designs, animals, bands, triangles, cross-hatching, and repeated patterns that seem almost too refined for a world without writing. These pots were not crude containers made only for storage. They were objects of identity, style, skill, and perhaps ritual meaning. Their designs spread across wide areas, creating a visual language shared by communities separated by long distances. That spread is what makes the Halaf world so important. It suggests a network, not an empire. Goods, ideas, styles, and perhaps people moved across northern Mesopotamia and beyond. Obsidian, stone, shells, and other materials traveled through exchange systems that linked villages into a broader cultural horizon. This was complexity before bureaucracy. A world could be connected without being ruled by one capital. A culture could share symbols without having a king standing above it. Halaf settlements were usually villages rather than cities, but they were not simple. Archaeologists have found distinctive circular buildings often called tholowi, some with rectangular annexes. Their function remains debated. They may have been houses, storage buildings, ritual spaces, or special communal structures. Their rounded forms appear again and again, enough to suggest a shared architectural tradition. In a time before monumental temples dominated the landscape, the Halaf people were already marking space in ways that mattered. But here is where the mystery begins. The Halaf culture leaves us beauty without explanation. Its pottery is covered in signs of care and pattern, but not readable language. Its buildings repeat, but we do not know the ceremonies, family structures, or beliefs that gave them meaning. Its networks connected communities, but we do not know the names of those communities. There are no tablets telling us what a painted bowl meant, who made it, who owned it, or why certain designs traveled farther than others. The Halaf world is visible through form, but silent in voice. This silence matters because the Halaf culture sits in a crucial position before the rise of larger Mesopotamian societies. It shows that the foundations of civilization were not only built in the alluvial south where Sumer would later rise. Northern Mesopotamia also had deep traditions of craft, settlement, exchange, and social identity. The region was not waiting passively for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. It was creating its own experiments in community and connection. The most unsettling implication is that state civilization may have inherited more from village worlds than history usually admits. Before writing, people already knew how to share style across distance. Before kings, they already knew how to organize production and exchange. Before cities, they already knew how to build places with repeated forms and shared meaning. The Halaf world reminds us that civilization was not born in a single leap. It grew from countless patterns practiced by people whose names are gone. Eventually, the Halaf culture faded and was absorbed or transformed as other cultural horizons expanded, especially the Ubaid world moving northward. Its pottery styles changed. Its settlement patterns shifted. The painted world did not end in one dramatic collapse. It dissolved into later traditions, leaving traces inside the deeper ancestry of Mesopotamian civilization. That is why the Halaf culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It was not an empire, and that is exactly why it matters. It proves that complexity does not always begin with kings, walls, armies, or writing. Sometimes it begins with villages linked by exchange, circular buildings whose purpose we cannot name, and painted pottery so carefully made that it becomes the only surviving voice of a vanished world. The Halaf people did not write history, but they painted one of its earliest hidden foundations into clay. Number 8. The Samarra culture. The irrigation world before the first cities, before Sumerian cities rose from the southern marshes, before scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into clay, before Mesopotamia became the textbook birthplace of civilization, communities farther north were already learning how to control water, organize labor, and turn difficult land into settlement. One of those worlds is now called the Samarra culture, named after a site in modern Iraq. It flourished in the 6th millennium BCE, long before Uruk, long before kings whose names could be written, and long before the first true cities announced themselves to history. The Samarra culture matters because it shows something crucial happening before urban civilization. People were beginning to organize landscapes, not just live inside them. In parts of northern Mesopotamia, rainfall alone was not always enough. Fields needed water, water needed channels, channels needed maintenance, maintenance needed cooperation. This is where irrigation becomes more than technology, it becomes a social system. To move water through land, people had to agree, plan, dig, repair, schedule, and trust one another across seasons. That may sound simple, but it is one of the hidden foundations of civilization. Irrigation teaches a community to coordinate labor beyond one household. It creates dependence on shared infrastructure. It rewards leadership, planning, storage, and long-term thinking. The Samarra people were not building cities yet, but they were practicing behaviors that cities would later magnify: water control, food surplus, organized work, settlement stability, and social obligation. Their villages show increasing complexity. Houses were built with care, settlements became more structured, agriculture supported larger communities, storage and craft production became more important. This was not a world of wandering bands living only from day to day. It was a world where people shaped their environment and expected that environment to keep feeding them. That expectation is one of the first steps toward civilization, and one of the first ways civilization becomes fragile. The Samarra culture is also known for its pottery, some of the most striking of prehistoric Mesopotamia. Bowls and vessels were painted with geometric patterns, animals, dancing human figures, birds, scorpions, and repeated designs that seem to move around the surface. Some famous pieces show highly stylized figures arranged in swirling compositions, as if ritual, movement, and symbolic order had been frozen in clay. These were not merely containers, they were objects of meaning. But here is where the mystery begins. We can see the designs, but we cannot read them. We do not know whether the painted figures show ceremonies, myths, clan identities, seasonal rites, or something else entirely. We do not know what the animals meant. We do not know whether the repeated patterns marked ownership, belief, memory, or beauty. Like so many prehistoric cultures, Samarra stands at the edge of communication. It clearly had symbols, but not a script we can translate. It clearly had order, but not a state we can name. This makes the Samarra culture especially important in the story of Mesopotamia. The later cities of Sumer did not appear in an empty world. They rose after thousands of years of experimentation with farming, irrigation, pottery, settlement, exchange, and ritual. Samarra was part of that buried prehistory. It shows that the roots of Mesopotamian civilization ran through village societies that were already solving the problems cities would later depend on. And yet, Samarra itself did not become famous like Sumer. It left no epic, no king list, no law code, no ziggurat remembered by name. Its contribution was quieter, the slow discovery that humans could reorganize water, land, and community into a system. Later civilizations would turn that system into city, states, temples, tax records, canals, and empires. But the first lessons were learned earlier, by people whose names vanished. That is why the Samarra culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It proves that before history had cities, it already had the logic of cities forming in the ground. Irrigation, cooperation, symbolism, food production, and settlement order were all being tested long before scribes began writing. The Samarra people did not invent civilization in one dramatic moment. They did something more hidden and perhaps more important. They taught the land to obey water, and in doing so, helped teach humans how to organize themselves around a future larger than the village. Number 7. The Jōmon culture, the pottery world before farming in prehistoric Japan, thousands of years before samurai, emperors, shrines, and written chronicles. People were making pottery so early that it disrupts one of the most familiar stories of civilization. The Jōmon culture began in the deep prehistoric past and lasted for an astonishing span of time, with regional variations stretching across millennia. They did not leave palaces, kings, or written law, but they created one of the longest, lasting, and strangest prehistoric traditions on Earth, a world where pottery, settlement, ritual, and symbolic life developed without following the standard path from farming to civilization. The name Jōmon means cord marked, referring to the rope, like impressions pressed into much of their pottery. But that simple label hides something extraordinary. Some Jōmon pottery ranks among the oldest known in the world, appearing long before pottery was supposed to become a normal feature of settled agricultural life. People settle down, farm grain, store surplus, and then need containers. But in Japan, pottery appears among communities that were still heavily dependent on hunting, fishing, gathering, nuts, shellfish, and forest resources. The container came before the classic farming village that matters because it breaks a clean narrative. The Jōmon people show that complexity did not always require wheat fields, cattle, kings, or irrigation states. Their islands offered rich coastlines, forests, rivers, and seasonal resources. In some places, those resources were abundant enough to support long-term settlements without intensive cereal agriculture. People built pit houses, returned to the same locations, created shell middens, buried their dead, and developed craft traditions that endured across generations. They were not simply wandering bands waiting to become farmers. They had already created a different kind of stability. Their pottery became increasingly elaborate. Some vessels are practical and rough. Others are wild, sculptural, and almost volcanic in shape, with flame-like rims, twisting forms, and dramatic ornamentation. These were not only cooking pots. Some seemed designed to impress, to signal identity, to participate in ritual, or to embody a symbolic world we can no longer read. A pot can be a tool, but in Jōmon hands, it could also become a statement, a ceremonial object, or a piece of visual power. Then there are the dog figurines. Small clay figures, often with exaggerated bodies, large eyes, strange faces, and mysterious markings. Some appear broken deliberately. Some may relate to fertility, healing, protection, ritual exchange, or spirit belief. The truth is uncertain. What makes them so haunting is that they look intentional in ways we cannot translate. They are clearly not random toys. They came from a world full of symbolic meanings that did not need writing to be real. This is where the Jōmon culture becomes one of the strongest challenges to the farming first model. In many regions, agriculture is treated as the engine of social complexity. But Jōmon communities show another route, a rich hunter, gatherer, fisher world, with pottery, settlements, rituals, cemeteries, trade, and elaborate art. They prove that people could become complex without becoming farmers in the classic Near Eastern sense. Civilization was not a single road. It was a branching forest. The Jōmon also had long-distance exchange networks. Materials such as obsidian moved between regions, showing that communities were connected across water and land. Shell ornaments, stone tools, lacquered objects, and ritual items suggest a society with craft specialization, shared styles, and social ties beyond a single settlement. Without cities or written bureaucracy, they still created worlds of communication and belonging. Eventually, later changes transformed the Japanese archipelago. Rice agriculture, new technologies, and incoming cultural influences reshaped society during the Yayoi period. The Jōmon world did not simply vanish in one dramatic collapse, but it was absorbed, transformed, and pushed into new historical layers. Its long experiment in complex hunter-gatherer life gave way to a different model of food, settlement, and power. That is why the Jōmon culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It proves that pottery did not always wait for farming, that settlement did not always require grain fields, and that symbolic complexity did not need kings or writing to flourish. They built no empire, but they left behind a question that still unsettles archaeology. What if complexity was never one path at all? In their cord, marked vessels, flame-shaped pots, shell mounds, pit houses, and silent dog figures, they left the record of a civilization. Like world that grew from forests and seas instead of fields and thrones. Number 6. The Natufians, the hunter. Gatherers who stood at the edge of farming before farming transformed the world, before villages became towns, before grain fields became the foundation of civilization. There were people in the Levant who had not fully crossed into agriculture, but had already stopped living like simple wanderers. They are known as the Natufians, and they lived roughly between 15,000 and 11,500 years ago, across parts of the eastern Mediterranean world, modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and surrounding regions. They were hunter-gatherers, but not in the old textbook sense. They built houses. They buried their dead with care. They harvested wild grains. They returned to the same places again and again. They stood at the threshold between two human worlds. The Natufians matter because they blur the line between mobile foragers and settled farmers. The standard story says people began farming, then settled down. But the Natufians suggest the order was not always that simple. Some of their communities became semi-sedentary before full agriculture existed. They lived in stone-built or semi-subterranean houses, used grinding stones, sickle blades, storage pits, and tools connected to intensive plant gathering. They were not yet farmers in the later Neolithic sense, but they were already behaving like people tied to place. This changes everything. Settlement is not only about food, it is about memory. If people return to the same place, they begin to build relationships with land, ancestors, graves, resources, paths, and seasons. A camp becomes more than shelter. It becomes a place with a past. The Natufians seem to have been creating that kind of world before domesticated wheat and barley took over human life. Their use of wild cereals is especially important. The Natufians harvested grains long before agriculture became fully established. They used stone tools with glossy sickle edges, evidence of cutting grasses repeatedly. They ground seeds into food. They lived in landscapes where wild wheat and barley could be gathered in large quantities. Over time, this close relationship with plants may have helped prepare the way for domestication. Farming may not have appeared as a sudden invention. It may have grown from generations of people already harvesting, processing, storing, and depending on wild plants. But here is where the mystery begins. The Natufians were not merely economic pioneers. Their burials show a symbolic and emotional world that was already complex. Some graves contain ornaments made from shells, bone, teeth, and stone. Some people were buried with dogs, suggesting one of the earliest known close relationships between humans and domesticated or semi-domesticated canids. Some burials show careful arrangement of bodies, skulls, and grave goods. Death was not treated casually. The dead belonged to place, and perhaps place belonged to the dead. This is one of the hidden foundations of civilization. Before written laws, before temples, before kings, humans were already binding communities through ancestry, burial, memory, and return. A settled life becomes easier when the dead are beneath the ground you occupy. Ancestors turn land into inheritance. Graves turn camps into homelands. The Natufians may have helped create that shift, not by building empires, but by teaching people that a place could hold identity across generations. Then the climate changed. Near the end of the Natufian period, the younger dryas brought cooler, drier conditions to parts of the region. Wild resources may have become less predictable. Communities that had grown used to rich gathering zones faced pressure. Some groups may have become more mobile again. Others may have intensified their use of plants. Out of that pressure, over time, came the Neolithic world, farming villages, domesticated grains, larger settlements, and eventually the long road to cities. That is why the Natufians belong among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. They were not farmers, but they helped create the conditions that made farming possible. They were not city builders, but they lived in ways that made permanent community imaginable. They were not kings or scribes, but they shaped the human relationship with place, food, dogs, death, and memory. The most haunting part is how quiet their revolution was. There was no single moment when someone declared that civilization had begun. No first king, no first city wall, no first written law. Instead, there were stone houses, wild grains, grinding tools, buried ancestors, shell beads, dogs in graves, and people returning to the same ground until the ground became home. The Natufians stood at the edge of farming, looking back at the hunter, gatherer world and forward toward everything that would follow. They did not build civilization. They made it possible to stay long enough for civilization to begin. Number 5. Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. The skull cult before civilization, before pottery became common, before cities rose behind walls, before kings controlled grain and scribes recorded offerings, communities across the Levant and Anatolia were already building a world far more complex than the old timeline allowed. Archaeologists call this period Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, or PPNB. The name sounds dry, but the world behind it was unsettling. Large settlements, rectangular houses, early farming, animal domestication, long-distance exchange, and rituals focused on the dead so powerful that they still disturb us thousands of years later. The timing is what makes it so strange. Pottery is usually imagined as one of the basic signs of settled life. People farm, store grain, cook food, hold water, and make clay vessels. But in the PPNB world, many communities had already crossed into large-scale settlement before pottery became widespread. They built with stone, mud brick, timber, plaster, and lime. They created houses with prepared floors and organized rooms. They cultivated crops, herded animals, and lived in communities that could hold hundreds or even thousands of people. Civilization had not arrived yet, but many of its pressures were already forming. Settled life creates problems that mobile life avoids. When people remain in one place, they must manage food, waste, disease, property, conflict, storage, kinship, and memory. A large village is not just more houses, it is more obligations, more ancestors, more disputes, and more need for shared meaning. The PPNB world shows humans learning how to live together at a new scale. Some solutions were practical, others were ritual. And this is where the mystery becomes darker. At several PPNB sites, archaeologists have found human skulls that were removed, preserved, remodeled, and sometimes covered with plaster to recreate faces. Shells could be placed in the eye sockets. Features could be shaped in lime. The result was not simply a bone. It was a dead human face remade by the living. These plastered skulls are among the most haunting artifacts of the Neolithic world. What did they mean? The usual answer is ancestor worship, but that phrase may be too small. These skulls may have represented lineage, memory, authority, household identity, ritual power, or the continued presence of the dead among the living. A skull is not an abstract symbol. It is a person reduced to the most recognizable part of the body, then rebuilt into a face. To keep such an object inside a community suggests that death did not remove people completely from social life. This may be one of the hidden foundations of civilization. Before written law, before states, before formal temples, communities needed ways to make people cooperate beyond immediate family. Ancestors can do that. Shared ritual can do that. A house connected to the dead becomes more than shelter. It becomes memory, inheritance, and authority. The living are no longer just occupying a place. They are living under the gaze of those who came before. PPNB communities also show long-distance exchange. Obsidian moved across regions, shells, stone tools, and symbolic materials traveled between settlements. Ideas moved too. The practice of plastered skulls appears across multiple sites, suggesting shared ritual concepts or communication between communities. This was not an isolated village habit. It was part of a wider Neolithic world beginning to build, bury, trade, and remember in connected ways. But here is the unsettling part. We can see the faces, but we cannot hear the names. The plastered skulls look intimate, almost personal, yet the people behind them are unreachable. We do not know whether they belong to elders, leaders, relatives, shamans, founders, or enemies. We do not know what words were spoken when they were displayed, buried, hidden, or remade. The ritual is visible, the meaning is gone. That is why Pre-Pottery Neolithic B belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It shows that before pottery, before writing, and before cities, humans were already experimenting with settlement, agriculture, trade, architecture, and ritual memory. They were learning how to make large communities hold together, not only through food and houses, but through the dead. The plastered skulls stare back across 9,000 years, their eyes filled with shell, their faces remade by hands that believed memory could be given shape. Civilization did not begin only when humans built walls. It began when they made the dead part of the architecture of the living. Number 4. The Yangshao culture, the painted villages beneath Chinese civilization before dynasties ruled the Yellow River, before oracle bones recorded royal divination, before bronze vessels carried the names of kings. There were farming villages in northern China painting clay with symbols, patterns, animals, and human forms. This world is now called the Yangshao culture, and it flourished for thousands of years across the Middle Yellow River region and beyond. It did not leave imperial histories. It did not leave palaces like later China. But beneath the dynastic world everyone remembers, Yangshao communities were already shaping the deep foundations of Chinese civilization. The Yangshao people lived in settled villages, farmed millet, raised animals, made tools, built houses, stored food, buried their dead, and created some of the most recognizable painted pottery of prehistoric East Asia. Their vessels were decorated with sweeping black and red designs, spirals, triangles, fish, birds, human faces, nets, and geometric patterns that seem to carry more than decoration. Some pots look practical, others look ceremonial. Many suggest a shared symbolic language whose meaning is now almost completely lost. What makes Yangshao important is that it shows civilization forming long before the first Chinese dynasties wrote their own stories. These were not tiny, isolated camps. Some Yangshao settlements were large and organized, with houses arranged around open spaces, storage pits, cemeteries, and craft areas. People were not merely surviving from season to season, they were building communities with repeated plans, shared customs, and long-term attachment to place. That attachment matters. A village that lasts across generations becomes more than shelter. It becomes ancestry, land, memory, and identity. The dead are buried nearby. Food is grown in familiar fields. Children inherit patterns, tools, and the Yangshao world shows early China developing not from a single royal invention, but from deep village traditions that connected farming, ritual, family, craft, and landscape. But here is where the mystery begins. Yangshao pottery is full of signs, faces, and repeated patterns. But we cannot read them as writing. We do not know whether the fish and human face motifs represented clans, spirits, myths, ancestors, fertility, rivers, or ritual roles. We do not know what ceremonies took place around the painted vessels. We do not know the names of their communities or the words they used for the forces around them. The objects are vivid, but the language behind them is gone. Their burial practices also hint at social complexity. Cemeteries show differences in grave goods and treatment of the dead. Some burials contain pottery, ornaments, or tools. Others are simpler. The pattern does not yet look like a fully ranked state society, but it suggests that identity, status, age, gender, family, and ritual already mattered deeply. Long before emperors, people were already organizing the dead into meaningful social worlds. Yangshao also matters because it complicates the idea that Chinese civilization began only with bronze and writing. Later, dynastic China inherited agricultural landscapes, village life, ancestor importance, pottery traditions, ritual habits, and symbolic thinking from much older worlds. The Yellow River did not suddenly become a cradle of civilization when kings appeared. It had been prepared by centuries of farmers, potters, builders, and ritual communities whose names were never written down. Eventually, Yangshao culture transformed and gave way to later Neolithic cultures, including more socially complex worlds such as Longshan in some regions. Settlement patterns changed, social hierarchy deepened. Fortifications appeared elsewhere, the road toward early states became clearer. But Yangshao remained one of the deep roots beneath that process. A painted world before dynastic memory. That is why the Yangshao culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It proves that the foundations of China were not created suddenly by kings, bronze, or writing. They were built slowly in villages, in fields of millet, in cemeteries, in painted pottery, and in symbols whose meanings no one can fully recover. The Yangshao people did not write history, but they helped prepare the world where Chinese history would later begin. Their pots still speak in color and pattern, but the voices that explained them have fallen silent. Number 3. The Hongshan culture, the Jade world before Chinese dynasties, before China's first dynasties, carved power into bronze, before kings asked questions of ancestors on oracle bones, before imperial history began arranging the past into neat lines of succession, a strange ritual world was already rising far to the northeast. It is now called the Hongshan culture, and it flourished across parts of modern Liaoning, Inner Mongolia, and Hebei, thousands of years before the written dynasties of China. It did not leave royal records. It did not leave long inscriptions, but it left jade, temples, elite burials, goddess imagery, and sacred landscapes that suggest a level of social and religious complexity far older than many people imagine. The Hongshan culture is best known for jade, not simple beads or casual ornaments, but carefully carved objects shaped into dragons, animals, rings, clouds, birds, and forms whose meanings remain uncertain. Some of the most famous are the so-called pig dragons, curled jade creatures with rounded bodies and powerful heads. They look like symbols from a world already thinking in mythic forms. Later, Chinese civilization would treat jade as a material of purity, status, ritual, and immortality. Hongshan shows that this sacred relationship with jade reaches deep into prehistory. That is what makes Hongshan so important. It suggests that some of the symbolic foundations of Chinese civilization were already forming long before dynastic states. Jade was difficult to work. It required time, skill, patience, and specialized knowledge. To carve, it was not ordinary craft. It was labor invested into objects that likely carried ritual authority. The people who possessed these objects may have held special status. Their burials suggest social differences, ceremonial roles, and a world where power was beginning to gather around sacred materials. But Hongshan was not only a jade culture. At sites such as New Heliang, archaeologists found ritual architecture that changed the way scholars thought about prehistoric northern China. There were ceremonial platforms, stone structures, elite tombs, and the remains of a building sometimes described as a goddess temple. Clay fragments from female figures, including parts of faces and bodies, suggest ritual imagery connected to fertility, ancestry, divinity, or powers we cannot name with certainty. This was not a simple farming world with a few decorations. It was a sacred landscape. The idea of a goddess temple is especially haunting because it opens a door into beliefs we cannot reconstruct. Who was represented there? A mother figure, an ancestor, a deity linked to land, fertility, animals, or the dead? Were the rituals performed by specialists? Did communities gather there seasonally? Did the jade dragons belong to the same symbolic system? The evidence points toward organized ritual life, but the meaning remains locked. We can see the sacred architecture, but not the prayers. Hongshan also challenges the idea that early Chinese civilization grew from one single center along the Yellow River. The later dynastic story often focuses on the central plains, but Hongshan shows that the road toward complexity had multiple regions, multiple experiments, and multiple symbolic worlds. Northeastern China was not outside the story. It was one of the places where hierarchy, ritual, jade symbolism, and ceremonial landscapes were being developed long before written kings appeared. But here is where the mystery deepens. Hongshan eventually faded, and its sites were abandoned or transformed. Environmental changes, social shifts, resource pressure, or interaction with other cultures may have contributed. The jade objects survived, the tombs survived, the temple remains survived, but the names of the people, the structure of their rituals, and the language of their symbols vanished. Later, Chinese civilization may have inherited echoes of jade reverence, dragon imagery, and ancestral ritual. But the direct voice of Hongshan is gone. That silence makes the jade even more powerful. A bronze inscription can tell you a king's name. A jade dragon cannot. It can only show that someone, long before history began speaking, believed this object mattered enough to carve, polish, bury, and preserve. It is proof of meaning without the meaning itself. That is why the Hongshan culture belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It shows that the roots of Chinese symbolic life were deeper and wider than dynastic history alone. Before emperors, before bronze capitals, before oracle bone writing, there were communities in the northeast carving dragons from jade and building sacred places for powers whose names are lost. The Hongshan people did not write the first chapters of Chinese history. They carved them in green stone, then vanished before anyone could read them aloud. Number 2. The Norte Chico Network. The civilization hidden behind Carol is the name most people remember. But Carol was never alone. Across the desert valleys of coastal Peru, long before the Inca, before the Nazca lines, before the Maya built their great cities, there was a wider world of monumental centers, now known as the Norte Chico, or Carol Soup civilization. It stretched between the Pacific coast and dry interior, where life depended on water, cotton, fish, fields, and ritual gathering. This was not one isolated city. It was a network. That is what makes Norte Chico so important. If Carol were only one strange site, it could be treated as an exception. But dozens of sites show that something larger was happening. People built platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, ceremonial spaces, residential zones, and organized settlements across multiple valleys. Monumental architecture appeared not as an accident, but as part of a shared cultural system. The civilization was not centered only on one pyramid. It was spread across a landscape. The timing breaks the old model. Norte Chico flourished around the 3rd millennium BCE, contemporary with early Egypt and Mesopotamia, but developing independently in the Americas. It had no contact with the Nile, no blueprint from Sumer, no Old World animals or metals, and no known writing system like cuneiform or hieroglyphs. Yet it organized labor at a monumental scale. It built public spaces where communities gathered, performed rituals, exchanged goods, and maintained order. Civilization did not need to cross an ocean to appear in Peru. The economy was unusual. Rather than fitting the image of a grain-based farming civilization, Norte Chico connected inland agriculture with coastal fishing. Cotton grown in the valleys could be used to make nets, and nets could support marine food production. Fish helped feed inland populations, crops helped support the coast, water from rivers made the desert productive. The sea made settlement possible. The civilization was built out of exchange between environments. But here is where the mystery begins. Norte Chico has very little evidence of warfare. There are no obvious fortifications, no mass weapons, no carved battle scenes, no heroic kings shown crushing enemies. In many ancient civilizations, power advertises itself through violence. Norte Chico does not speak that way. Its monuments seem focused on gathering, ritual, music, and ceremony, rather than conquest. That does not mean it was perfectly peaceful, but it suggests that early civilization in the Andes may have formed around integration rather than war. The social structure remains difficult to see. Someone organized the labor, someone planned the plazas, someone managed exchange between coast and inland valley, someone decided where monuments would rise, but there are no royal tombs shouting names, no palaces filled with gold, no inscriptions declaring authority. Power existed, but it hid behind architecture and ritual rather than written propaganda. Norte Chico looks like a civilization whose leaders did not preserve themselves as individuals. One of the most haunting clues is the quipu-like object found at Carol. Knotted cords would later become the information system of the Inca, used for records, numbers, tribute, and perhaps much more. If similar cord technology existed in Norte Chico, then Andean record-keeping may have roots thousands of years deeper than the Inca. But we cannot read those early cords. We do not know whether they counted labor, offerings, fish, crops, people, rituals, or stories. The information may be there, but the code is gone. Music also appears in this world. Bone flutes and other instruments suggest that sound had a role in ceremony. Imagine people gathering in circular plazas while instruments echoed against stone and desert air. Without readable texts, ritual sound may have been one-way memory moved through the community. Norte Chico did not need writing to create shared experience. It built places where people could feel order together. Eventually, the Norte Chico centers declined. Environmental shifts, earthquakes, floods, drought, or changes in river and coastal systems may have broken the delicate balance that held the network together. Later Andean civilizations would rise with new forms and new political worlds, but the older network faded, leaving its plazas and mounds in the desert. That is why the Norte Chico network belongs among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It proves that complexity in the Americas began earlier than many people once believed, and that civilization did not have one formula. It could rise without visible kings, obvious war, or writing as we usually define it. In the valleys of Peru, people built a civilization from cotton, fish, rivers, ritual, music and stone. The pyramids remain under the desert sun, but the chords that may have held their memory are silent. Number 1. The Tar-Tapela Network. The ritual world before civilization for years. Göbekli Tepe looked like an impossibility standing alone, a stone ritual complex built by hunter-gatherers before farming, before pottery, before cities, and before writing. It was so old that it seemed to overturn the entire story of civilization by itself. But the more archaeologists searched the hills of southeastern Turkey, the stranger the picture became. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. It was part of a wider prehistoric landscape now often called Tar-Tapela, the Stone Hills. This is why Tar-Tapela belongs at number 1. It changes the question completely. If Göbekli Tepe had been a single site, it could be treated as an anomaly, a brilliant but isolated sanctuary. But Karahan Tepe, Saber, Neville Ori, and other nearby sites suggest something much larger, a network of communities building monumental ritual spaces before agriculture was supposed to make such construction possible. The temple before civilization may not have been one temple. It may have been an entire world. The dating is what makes this so unsettling. These sites belong to the early Neolithic horizon, close to the deep age of Göbekli Tepe, when people in the region were still emerging from the hunter-gatherer world. They did not live in states. They did not have kings we can name. They did not leave writing, yet they carved stone pillars, shaped enclosures, created symbolic animals, built special structures, and returned to sacred places across generations. That requires memory, organization, shared belief, and labor coordination. Karahan Tepe is especially haunting. Archaeologists have found carved stone features, T-shaped pillars, human-like forms, animal imagery, and strange chambers that feel like ritual spaces frozen in stone. Saber has revealed carved scenes that may show humans and animals arranged almost like narrative images. Neville Ori, now submerged beneath dam waters, also contained T-shaped pillars and ritual architecture connected to the same symbolic world. These are not random monuments. They are pieces of a pattern. That pattern forces us to rethink the birth of civilization. The old model said humans settled down because of farming, then built complex religion after surplus made specialization possible. Tar-Tapela suggests something more disturbing. Ritual gathering may have pulled people together before agriculture fully took hold. Sacred places may have created the need for repeated meetings, feasting, labor, cooperation, and eventually more reliable food production. Belief may not have been the decoration of civilization. It may have been one of the engines that created it. Think about what it means for hunter-gatherer communities to build in stone. A temporary camp follows food and season. A stone enclosure asks people to return. A carved pillar asks them to remember. A ritual landscape anchors groups to place before farming fixes them there. This may be one of the deepest shifts in human history. The moment when memory became architectural, when belief turned landscape into obligation. But here is where the mystery becomes darker. We still do not know what these places meant. The animals carved on pillars may represent dangers, spirits, clans, myths, death, or powers beyond modern categories. Human-like pillars may represent ancestors, supernatural beings, or ritual participants. The architecture may have been used for feasts, initiations, funerary rites, seasonal gatherings, or ceremonies, connected to death and rebirth. Every interpretation opens a door, but none gives us the key. The builders left no texts. No prayer survives. No name of a god survives. No myth can be matched securely to a pillar. We can see the stones, but not the voices around them. We can see the animals, but not the stories they carried. We can see that something mattered enough to organize generations of labor, but not what that something was. Tatapella is a sacred network without a readable doctrine. That is why the Tatapella network belongs at number 1 among the forgotten prehistoric cultures that rewrote civilization. It shows that Göbekli Tepe was not a lone miracle. It was part of a larger ritual horizon, a buried world of stone hills, where humans gathered before the official beginning of civilization. These people did not wait for cities to create meaning. They created meaning, and perhaps cities followed. The most unsettling lesson is that history may begin far too late. Written records capture only the last thin layer of the human story. Beneath them are thousands of years of ritual, memory, architecture, and belief that left no words. Before kings, before scribes, before fields, before walls, humans were already building sacred worlds in stone. We do not know what they called those places. We do not know what they believed, but the pillars remain, proving that civilization may have begun as a mystery before it became a city.